All right, everyone, this is Ross Raddi, and welcome to another episode of Fruit Talk. This is the podcast-style video that I do for you guys every Wednesday night at 9 o'clock Eastern. We talk a lot about fruits and a lot about vegetables and how to use all this stuff in the kitchen, and also how to grow it. And in tonight's episode, we're going to be talking once again about figs, and in particular, we're going to be mentioning kind of the whole fig season etiquette and what to expect and kind of different tips and tricks that I recommend to you guys. We're going to talk about the cuttings themselves and what you should be expecting as a buyer, what you should be doing as a trader, what you should be doing as a seller, you name it. And this is, largely applicable to figs, but I think this can be definitely used in many different fruits, right? It's not just figs that we take cuttings from. It's also other fruit trees. So you can kind of take the same little tips and tricks that I'm going to give you guys in this video and apply it to just about everything else. Hello everyone, welcome to the live stream as well. So thank you guys for joining me here. We didn't end up posting anything on the blog or on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter this time around. Kind of a last minute thing. I realized it's 9 o'clock on a Wednesday and I forgot to record this, so we'll do it live. But we'll also do, for those of you guys who are just joining me now in the chat, we're going to do a Q&A at the end, so you guys can have any questions that you might have answered. I do want to mention at the beginning of this, because I know I'm going to get questions, if I'm selling cuttings, right now I'm not selling any cuttings. And the plan is to not really sell any cuttings until maybe mid-November, because around mid-November, that's when I'll start taking them. However, I may take some prematurely. You never know. But if I am going to sell cuttings, it'll be on FigVidcom, and that's definitely the website that I'm going to use. You don't need to message me individually. Whatever I sell will be on here. I'm not taking any sales, in a private message somewhere or an email, just because it's a lot less work to do it this way. Also, I really like this website. I really like how Danny, the owner and the creator of this website, how he runs it. I like this whole thing for tax purposes. I mean, there's 1,000,001 reasons why to do it through FigVid and not through private message. So if you're interested, check out FigVid. And of course, I'll let you guys know when really the cuttings are going to start coming, whether that's on the blog, figboss.com, or on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. So let's kind of get into this episode now. So the fig cutting etiquette, I think, is probably like one of the bigger points. And I've been seeing a lot of people in the fig forums here. I have a couple R figs threads that I want to kind of look over and just read through some things that people have been constantly bringing up that may seem very obvious or pretty simple to someone like me who's been doing this. I've been through almost 6 winters of cuttings now or something like that. So for the new guys, the new people, this is really going to help you. This is one of those episodes of Fruit Talk, I think, that is going to save you just a crap load of money. If you're really into this, you really are buying figs, many fig varieties this wintertime, this is really the video for you. This video pays for itself. If I get a Patreon subscriber from this video as an example, in my opinion, it's totally worth it, because the amount of money that I'm going to save you is way more than what you could potentially contribute on Patreon. So definitely a little plug there, a little encouragement to you guys, but I really do believe that, and I really think that you guys are going to learn something here. So with the etiquette, I think it's pretty simple. You want to be giving people cuttings that you would like to receive, right? I mean, that's just the nature of giving gifts or trading or treating other people, right? You want to treat other people the way you want to be treated. So it's pretty simple. I would say the most ideal cutting, and of course you can't always have ideal cuttings, right? Especially in a trade with a friend, it's not always going to be ideal, and you have to kind of realize that there's no one really out to get you guys. Most of these people are doing this out of their own kindness, out of their own heart. They want to spread the hobby. They want other people to grow figs. They're not out to get you. And there's some people who are very suspicious, and people who maybe are a bit pessimistic on human nature. There are some greedy people out there, and those I think are the people you really have to watch out for, and that's where the issues can arise. We'll get to that in a minute. But for the most part, if you guys are dealing with cuttings, most of the people are good people, kind-hearted people. So they're going to give you what they can. And a lot of times, people's trees are just young. We don't all have access to land or tons of land. We're growing them in pots. And, if I had all my trees planted in the ground, which I finally have a pretty good number of them now planted in the ground, but if I had them in the ground, they grow like crazy. They really put out a lot of growth. And it really just goes to show, when you look at the amount of cuttings you can get off of an in-ground tree versus the amount of cuttings you would get off of a potted tree, it's almost like a night and day difference, right? You could plant, let's say, like a 5-gallon sized tree, or maybe even a 3-gallon, or even a really, really strongly rooted 1-gallon sized tree. You could put that in the ground in the beginning of the spring, and that tree is going to get to 6 foot tall and multiple branches. Whereas if you had that in a pot, it's going to be nothing close to that. I mean, unless you really were feeding like crazy. But it just goes to show that, not everyone's going to have these things in huge quantity. It's just not something that even some people want to do. Some people may not even want to prune their trees. And I can certainly attest to that myself. I don't really want to be pruning a lot of my trees this year. A lot of my potted trees will not get pruned, or very, very minimal pruning will be done. I have a friend, a good friend of mine, who I've heard from a couple people, he doesn't really give the best quality cuttings, and I certainly would agree with that. But if you look at what his objectives are and what he's into this for, is to get fruit and to get high quality fruit. And if you're going to be pruning hard, you're going to be doing this a lot. You're going to do a lot of pruning. You're going to lose productivity. You're going to lose earliness. You're going to lose a lot. Even potentially the quality of the fruits, depending on if they ripen earlier versus later. There's a lot that goes into this, and I just kind of want people to be more aware of that some people even may just make a mistake and not even realize they made a mistake. Like I said, there's a lot of new people in here. Sometimes you take cuttings, you're doing this, you're trying to kind of do this really quickly, right? We're on kind of a clock if you sort of think about it. At least the way that I like to do it is that you only have so much time before you get your trees away, and they're there for good. You don't want to be moving your trees out of storage, and sometimes you can't get into storage, and it's just a mess in terms of like time and the logistics of this whole thing, especially when you got a lot of varieties and there's so much to label and you don't want to make a mistake. And even just copying someone's address down could be a bit of a challenge. So I'm just saying, you really should cut people some slack, and none of this is all going to work out for you. It doesn't matter who it is that you're buying for, or buying from, I should say. If you're buying from, like, let's say the most reputable people in the fig community, something's going to go wrong. It doesn't matter who it is. There's always something out there that could potentially happen. Mistakes happen. These things are just inevitable. And as long as you can accept that, not every single cutting that you take or you receive is going to root. Not every cutting you have is going to store for an extremely long time. I think that's where some people, at least in the last year or two, have kind of gotten really hung up on. I'm really confused by that, because there used to be a ton of people when I first started that were just super appreciative to be getting anything at all. Not that people aren't appreciative nowadays, but you would never really hear a peep out of them if something failed or if something went wrong. And now people are much more eager to speak up and say, all right, well, this didn't go right, and point the finger at somebody. I would say 90 to 95% of the time, the issue that you're having is because of yourself. And I can attest to that even with myself. The cuttings that I receive from other people, sometimes they may not arrive in the greatest condition, but if you really know and you have the right experience, you can then kind of make a judgment call and just say, all right, well, this cutting, as an example, doesn't look really that lignified. And because it's not that well lignified, it's probably not going to store that well in the fridge or store well at all. I mean, it has the potential, and I'm not going to say it doesn't, because I've had plenty that have. Even just green cuttings that were hardened have stored well for quite a long time. However, it's good to take some steps towards that, and knowing that, okay, well, this probably isn't going to make it for 6 months in my fridge. This isn't probably going to make it all the way to the spring. So what you should do is kind of think ahead and be like, all right, well, I'm going to take some extra steps. First off, getting an unlignified cutting. This is a big tip here that I don't think anyone really is going to tell you. This is kind of my own little theory, and I've certainly noticed this. And actually, you know what? I've heard a couple people mention this to me as well. But if you're growing cuttings, you're growing figs in a humid climate, and you're buying, let's say you're buying cuttings from me as an example. I live in a humid climate, and a lot of the times here in a humid climate, it just rains so much that it's very difficult to get my figs to stop growing. The ideal scenario would be to get them to put out as much growth as possible in the spring. Then I pinch them, and then they put out all these fruits. And after they have really set all their fruit, they just completely stop growing for the rest of the year. They're done. They don't put out another leaf. All the way from, let's say, probably from like August onwards. If they put out any growth from August onwards in my climate, in my humid climate, you're not going to have lignified growth by the end of the season. By right now, you're not going to have lignified growth. And then you're going to have this wood that you're giving to people or selling to people that's not lignified. And it really just comes down to the fact that it's very difficult in our climate to achieve such a thing. It's not like it's totally our fault. There's things that we can do, like slow down the growth as much as possible. And that's actually probably the best thing I did this year, was only feed my trees 4 times in the beginning of the spring. I really made sure I stopped the water as much as possible, kept out a lot of that water, even in the fall, with the trash bags that I was using. And a lot of my cuttings this year are actually very well lignified compared to prior years. It's actually a shock. Like, it's insane. But however, a lot of people in these humid climates, and I certainly have some that are not perfectly lignified, but if these people who are growing them in humid climates are not getting them fully lignified, this is just something that's going to happen, and you're going to have to deal with it. And you're going to have to take these unlignified cuttings that maybe are not dormant, maybe they are, it doesn't matter. What I would suggest is to throw them in the fridge for like 2 or 3 weeks, maybe 4 weeks. Put them in the fridge for a month. If you have cuttings, by the way, and you stick them in the fridge and they don't survive 2 to 4 weeks in the fridge, you just had a bad quality cutting to start. It wasn't going to do anything for you anyway. So throw it in the fridge for 2 to 4 weeks. What that's going to do is it's going to continue that dormancy process, further that dormancy process. Really get things, if they weren't dormant when you took them, kind of set that a little bit in motion for the cutting. I know that sounds weird and it's a bit strange, but I think it really helps with that dormancy issue that can be a potential thing that happens. The next thing that really happens when they're in the fridge for 2 to 4 weeks is that they callus up. All those ends that we cut, so if you have this is a pen, obviously, but this is a cutting as an example. We make a cut on the bottom, we make a cut on the top. Those are fresh cuts, right? And then I ship it to you. Well, this is not going to root right away because you need the bottom end that we stick into the soil. This has to callus up. If this doesn't callus and brown up, you ain't getting roots. So basically, if you're gonna sit there with these green cuttings and just have them in a warm environment, potentially very wet soil, you're not going to have good success. They're probably going to rot. So what I would do is, again, put them in the fridge for like 2 to 4 weeks. take them out and then start the rooting process, you're just going to have a lot more success that way. It's just a fact. So anyway, that is like a big tip right there. Another thing that you're looking for, I guess, in terms of quality, and this is kind of going to be a bit, I don't exactly have the right timeline with this, right? I don't have the bullet points sorted out in probably the perfect order for this episode, guys, but I'll say that what you're really looking for is pretty simple. You want, a 3-node cutting. It doesn't have to be a certain length. I would just say that 3 nodes is probably the standard. I've seen 3-node cuttings, and sometimes they're not really long enough. And what you should probably do is just say, all right, well, I have such close node spacing, and just throw in a couple more nodes, right? I mean, that seems a bit right. Definitely the amount of energy in the cutting is really what you're looking for. Yeah, you want enough nodes because if you think about it, some of you guys, and we're going to get right into this right here. This is a post on our Figs by this person here. I'm not entirely sure who this is, but they were basically took the cutting and labeled out all the nodes, right? And then they labeled for each node what they're doing with it. They have single node rooted cuttings, and this one's being rooted in diatomaceous earth. This is all very experimental, and this is awesome for this person who's doing this because it's good to experiment. Then they're doing, some of these are going to be, chip grafted and banana grafted, and it's a pretty impressive plan, to be honest with you, of what you can do with one cutting. However, you're not really going to have the greatest success with this in terms of rooting. Rooting a 1-node cutting is extremely difficult. The guy who made that very popular was Charlie Little back on Figs for Fun, and he has all kinds of data and detailed about how he did all these fig cuttings from 1 node, and it worked out pretty well for him, especially because it was only 1 node. But what you need to know about Charlie Little is that he is like a master propagator. That guy is like a pro. Yeah, he's not a pro. He didn't do this for a living, I don't think. However, the guy is so talented at propagating just about everything that he has some of the greenest thumb I've ever seen. And he's not just doing figs. I've seen him on Facebook. I'm friends with him on Facebook. He does like just about every single fruiting plant of propagation you can think of. And the guy is like, he's basically next level with this stuff. Are you next level enough to do a single node cutting? I doubt it. So my personal preference here is that you're looking for a cutting that has the most energy in it. If it has the most energy in it, it's going to put out the most vigorous growth, the most vigorous roots, the most vigorous growth. The combination of the two is going to net you, first off, the healthiest cutting possible, the largest cutting possible, and the cutting that isn't going to fail as easily. You're going to get to that point in which these cuttings are then somewhat stable a lot quicker, right? These are baby trees. These are trees that are going to be very difficult to deal with at such a young stage that getting them to that perfect point where that growth's lignified, the roots have lignified, everything is like somewhat stable. That's what you want. You don't want to be doing this, in a way that you're just like, well, I want 1 million plants. I don't think that's really a great way to be approaching this. In my experience, the more energy the cutting has, the better. Of course, if it's like 2-year-old growth or older and it's really thick, it may not root so well, right? But if it's 1-year-old growth and it has as much energy in it as possible, even a cutting that's like 3 feet long, 3 feet of new growth is incredible. You can't fail by doing that. In fact, if you really wanted to, take a cutting that's 2 to 3 foot long of 1-year-old growth that's well lignified and store that in your fridge, and then put that in the spring, stick that in the ground, and you're almost guaranteed to have that variety. You're almost guaranteed. It's like the easiest method of propagation there is. Even if you can kind of hold out maybe and forget about the storage part of that because it's 2 to 3 feet long. It's not going to fit in your fridge, but if you can take that cutting in the spring and then plant that out, you're guaranteed a cutting. Oh, another thing is if you can somehow find a way to get these cuttings fresh in the spring, and you can also get them, you can hold off, resist that urge to plant them until the spring. It's way better. Planting them in the spring in the ground is a million times better. I've had so much better success than rooting them inside. And the only real reason to root them inside is because, one, you want to get the cuttings now. You may not be able to find the varieties that you want in the spring. Also, you're going to get yourself a pretty large size plant. It's kind of like starting seeds, right? You start seeds indoors a couple weeks, a month earlier than you're going to transplant them outside. And that way you have yourself a better head start to the season. It's the same thing with these fig trees. You get them off to a better start. So that's personally what I'm looking for. And that's a big thing I think there's a big misconception about, is you want like healthy 1-year-old wood that has as much energy in it as possible. If you think about where's all the energy stored in a tree, it's stored in the highest points on the tree. So if you get cuttings that are from higher points on the tree, from 1-year-old growth, you're going to have the best success. You're probably going to have better success with healthier varieties. Not that I think certain varieties will root easier than others. I think that's sort of a myth, and I haven't really been able to prove it. And in fact, if you go back the last 7 or 8 years or 10 years that people have been growing figs online as a hobby, there's a thread like that every single year, and I bet you there's very few figs that are along that list every single year. Every year it seems like there's different varieties that people list. All right, so that's what I'm looking for, is to get a nice 1-year-old cutting here. Doesn't have to be a certain length, just a lot of energy in it, enough nodes. If I wanted to do this for grafting, it's better to have more nodes. Also, I think it's better to have thinner wood. It makes it easier to graft. I think a pencil thickness is probably the best, or thicker than pencil thickness is probably the best for everybody. The thicker the cutting, usually the more energy it contains. All right, so that's pretty much the cuttings that you guys are going to want to look for. Now, what you want to do, as my suggestion to what you want to do after you take them, because in this thread here, fig cutting etiquette, people are talking about what you're doing in terms of for the other person. I think it's good to cover shipping, right? So if you're sending it to somebody else in a trade, you cover the shipping, they cover your shipping. You can obviously work that out with the other person. Again, do what you would want from the other person. Treat people how you want to be treated, okay? Now, the next thing here, someone mentioned about waxing cuttings. I don't think you need to do this. So when you take these cuttings, the first thing you want to do is you want to try to keep them as fresh as possible. And to do that, you need to put them in plastic. Ideally, you even have a cooler with you, and you can put them in plastic, wrap them up, and then put them in the cooler after you take it. You need to label things. That's the first thing you do. You make a cut, make all the cuts you want, put them in a bag, or individually label every single cutting, or label the bag. Labeling is so important. And that's it. All I like to do, it's real simple. I take all the cuttings I want, I put them in a bread bag. It's a pretty thin layer of plastic. I label the bread bag the variety that I want. I roll that up, and then I put that into a second layer of plastic. This is exactly what you want. You want 2 layers of plastic. If you don't have 2 layers of plastic, the cuttings are going to dry out more than you would like. The name of the game when we store these things, because we're thinking about storage when we take them, the name of the game is to make sure that they have as much moisture as humanly possible, right? So that they don't dry out. Now, if you have too much moisture, you're going to rot the cuttings. So there's a nice little balance, a nice balance of the right moisture that you want, because when we take these cuttings, they have, or let's say they're at 100%. And the longer they sit in the fridge, the lower that percent goes down. Let's say, 6 months go by, maybe they're only at 60% or 50% of the viability that they once were, right? 100% being the perfect fresh cutting. 0% being 100% dead cutting, right? That doesn't make really any sense, but they're dead at 0, right? So somewhere in there, you got to slow that process down of it getting down to 0. I would say the easiest way to do this really is just to get them in the right storage conditions. So when we take them, we label them, we put them in the plastic, the 2 layers of plastic, and that's it. We don't have any wet paper towels, wet anything. We don't water the bag. We don't put any sphagnum peat moss in there and wet that. I guess you could put dry sphagnum peat moss in there if you wanted, but or very, very lightly damp sphagnum peat moss. But really the objective here is to wrap them in 2 layers of plastic, put them in the fridge, in the crisper drawer. And if you get them in the crisper drawer, you want to have the setting, and this is why they're in the crisper drawer, because it's a higher humidity environment in the crisper drawer. The vegetable drawer, and there's also the fruit drawer, depending on what it is that you want to have in there based off of the optimal storage conditions of these fruits and vegetables. Some want a higher humidity and some don't mind having a lower humidity, right? These cuttings want a higher humidity. So put them in the crisper drawer. That way there's even less chance of these things drying out. If you were to just put these cuttings, 2 layers of plastic, in the fridge and let it sit there, well, there's a higher chance, I think, and not in the crisper drawer, I think there's a higher chance that they're going to dry out. Making sure your crisper drawer has high humidity is pretty good. It's pretty important. And if you do that, right, you get yourself a cutting that's quality cutting. You took it fresh, you put it in the layers of plastic, you did that in a reasonable amount of time since you took it, right? We're not like letting the cuttings sit out in the sun for 6 hours. We're putting it in the bags, and we're putting it in the fridge in the crisper drawer. Those cuttings, if they're fully lignified, they're quality cuttings, they can store for up to a year in the fridge. Even more than a year. I've had cuttings, first off, that have stored for a year, but I'll tell you a crazy story is that I shipped some cuttings overseas to somebody, and their customs in their country caught it. And the customs held it up and eventually sent it back, but it took them 3 months for them to send it back to me. And believe it or not, these cuttings were still good. 3 months later of sitting in customs, which is absolutely ridiculous. They didn't have them in a fridge. I'm sure they were just sitting around doing something in optimal storage conditions, and these things looked like brand new, or close to brand new, I should say. So if you do this right, you get all the right lignified growth. Your trees are dormant, and that's another big thing here, is that maybe I should rewind a little bit. Some people believe that your trees should be completely dormant when you take them. Some people believe that it doesn't matter. In fact, a little bit of sap in the wood is actually a help, a benefit when you're rooting them. And I personally don't have any preference. However, I don't think it really matters if the tree is actually dormant. I will say it's a nice little bonus if the tree got hit with a couple frosts and the leaves fall off the tree. That makes it a lot easier for the leaves to come off and those figs to come off, so that you have a clean, fresh cutting that you can very easily store if you wanted, right? You don't want to store a cutting, by the way, with leaves in the fridge. You don't want to be storing a cutting with stems in the fridge. You don't want to be storing a cutting with figs on it. You got to take all that stuff off. And the rewind even further, I guess, is that to get all this really to work out well is that you want them to be as lignified as possible. I think that's really the key here. Is not necessarily are they dormant, are they not dormant. The real big thing here is are they lignified and fully lignified and lignified well, right? Not just green and hard, like green lignified, but brown and lignified and fully brown and lignified. I think it's probably, you know, if you have a cutting that's green but lignified but hard, I would say your storage at that point maybe could even be cut in half. So if you had it for a year, or you could store it for up to a year, you could probably only store it for a maximum of 6 months. If your cutting was like half lignified, you could probably store it for maybe 8 to 10 months, or maybe 9 months. I think 9 months is probably a good estimate. And even that maybe, you know, that's probably the absolute maximum. But if your cutting is fully lignified, it could probably store absolute maximum, again, for up to a year, the right storage conditions. So, you know, that's a big thing. And then to get them lignified like that, we need to rewind like 3 months ago in August. We needed to be thinking about stopping the food, stopping the water, getting our trees to really slow down their growth and stop growth actually almost completely. You want them really to stop growth. They'll lignify in time and you'll have a higher quality cutting. Okay, now there's a couple things you should do when you guys take these cuttings or receive them. Let's say you guys are buying cuttings from me. Once again, if you're watching at this point and you're trying to buy cuttings from me, everything will be done through FigVid. No need to message me individually. There's so many reasons why it's a lot easier for me to do it on FigVid. There's a lot of you guys interested every year in buying cuttings from me, so it's just so much easier if I do it through there. So what you guys should do when you receive the cutting is that I like to have my cuttings again in 2 layers of plastic, or you should put them in 2 layers of plastic. I'm going to have them in a bread bag, and I find this works really well, is just having them in a bread bag, and the bread bag is labeled. I may have many bread bags. I may have, you know, some people, what they do is they wrap them in parafilm as an example. Actually, not parafilm, I'm sorry, plastic wrap, or you could wrap them in parafilm and then wrap them in plastic wrap. You just need a certain layer of plastic, right? And if you have a bread bag and you wrap that bread bag a number of times, that's really going to keep that moisture in that bag. So what I would suggest, though, when you receive them is take them out of the bag. The bag is going to be labeled and what variety it is, but the individual cuttings will not. And depending on what you guys are doing and, you know, how meticulous you guys are, it's a great idea to label each individual cutting. It takes forever. Let's say I have 1,000 cuttings I take, 500 cuttings I take, individually labeling every single cutting, writing it on there is like a stupid amount of time. Plus, if you're using a Sharpie, it's probably not going to show up that well. You're using a paint pen, maybe it's not going to be that legible. So what I would do is get yourself a paint pen, label every single individual cutting with your own handwriting. You know what that is. So anyway along the rooting process or the grafting process, you have a double check as to what that is. You have it on the bag, you have it on the cutting, and every single individual cutting along the way. Personally, I don't need to do this. I'm an accountant. I literally keep records for a living. So I don't need to be labeling every single individual cutting. I'm just very careful with what I do and very meticulous. And I have a technique to every single thing that I do so that I don't make a mistake, right? So that's something I would do, is label every single cutting. Before you label them, I would probably give them a nice little rub down. And it's a good idea. If you guys really come in here with even a brush or something and lightly brush maybe there's some dead wood, maybe there's pieces of stem left over, just give the cutting, even with your thumb and your hands, just a nice little rub. You're gonna get a lot of that little, maybe some pests. You're gonna pretty much just clean up the cutting, making it look nice and new and healthy as possible, okay? Give it a little scrub with something, not too hard. You don't want to scrape off the bark. You just want to get it so that it's looking real fresh. Put it into the bleach solution that you guys have. 10% bleach. The rest of it, so 90% water, 10% bleach. Put them in there. That's going to kill maybe any pathogens, maybe any pests. Take them out of the bleach solution and let them sit there and let them dry. You can even dry them yourself and then put them back in the bag, or label them at that point. Put them back in the bag and make sure you have the best storage conditions. So that's the best recommendation I can give you guys right there of what you should do as soon as you get them. Also, what you should do as soon as you get them is you should probably keep them in the fridge. Like I mentioned before, keep them in the fridge for like 2 weeks. You know, depending on when exactly these cuttings were cut, depending on who cut them and when they did it. Again, you want them to be calloused so that when you put them in the rooting medium, you're rooting these, they should already be calloused. They don't need to callus up in a 70-degree environment that's quite dry and potentially drying them out right then and there, or maybe even has a wet soil and potentially rotting the cutting. So what you want to do really is get them in the fridge, let them callus up, and they can immediately begin that process of rooting when you stick them in the soil. Okay, so I think those are the big little lessons here of cuttings and what to expect. Again, you know, most of this is on you, as I've said. It's maybe a bit cruel, but even myself, you know, if I fail, it's my fault. 99 times, I should really say 90 to 95 times out of 100, it's your own fault. I mean, there's always that chance that the cutting just isn't gonna root and there's something wrong with it. Maybe they took them improperly. You know, maybe the person who grew it took the cuttings, made some sort of mistake. You know, it happens, and it's gonna happen. So you just have to accept that and move on and realize that most of this, though, if you fail, a lot of it is on you. And all this, guys, by the way, we go into just crazy detail of the rooting process last year. We did like 12 to 15 videos on just rooting cuttings, just rooting figs. I have a whole playlist, by the way, that talks about this whole process. So if you guys are interested, you want to know, I mean, this is going to be on my listings, right? I'm going to probably have a link to this video, you know, fig cutting etiquette, a link to the rooting playlist, so that you guys have all the information that you possibly need to succeed this year. Okay, so the wax, I just want to mention, in this particular thread, completely unnecessary. Some people like to do it. I personally, when I get a cutting that has wax on it, I like to take off the wax. I think it can potentially impede on the roots that may come out of the bottom. I think it's also a good idea, guys, to use pruning shears that have been cleaned. Certainly, at least at the beginning of when you're cutting your trees. But from tree to tree, I think it's also a great idea. Disinfect your cutting. Disinfect your pruning shears. So this person had a question about when to buy cuttings, and this really comes down to, again, when are you ready to use them, right? That's pretty much the answer. If you're ready to use them now, you have your rooting environment set up, you know, go ahead. Again, I don't think there's any difference in dormant cuttings versus non-dormant cuttings. The biggest thing you want to look out for is, are they lignified fully? That's the key here. You know, almost nobody has dormant cuttings right now. Yet, if you go on FigVid, there's plenty of people selling cuttings, and they'll tell you that their cuttings are dormant, but they're not, because almost nobody in the United States has gotten a really hard frost. It just hasn't happened. So if you're interested in buying cuttings that are dormant, you're just going to have to wait. And in all honesty, it's better for the grower, the person's tree, If you wait until the tree is actually dormant, all that sap flow goes from the wood down back into the roots. You're going to have much more carbohydrates stored in the roots to get you off to a better season the following year. So it's in everybody's best interest, for the most part, to just wait until the trees are dormant. You know, these people here who are selling them either are selling them because, well, you know, maybe they had to take some cuttings prematurely. Maybe they had to get rid of a tree. Maybe they made a judgment call. You know, or they're trying to get off to a nice little jump start to the season in terms of getting their cuttings out quicker, personal reasons, etc., etc. You know, maybe they're trying to meet the demand of the market a bit earlier, you know. But even people, I would say, in Maine haven't really had a crazy hard frost, at least to my knowledge. And I don't know too many people who are growing figs in Maine. All right. So here's a nice little tip here that Fruit Nut made on our figs. This is pretty simple though. You know, this is obviously the difference between a good quality cutting here on the right and a bad quality cutting on the left. And I don't know how old his cutting is on the left, but I'll tell you this, that if I took a cutting that looked like this and it was fresh, I would be a bit shocked. And that just means right here, this brown decay here, this is a portion of the tree that would then be dying off. And this is a good thing to do every single year when we're taking cuttings. We need to be cutting out all that dead wood, anything that seems to be damaged, diseased, right? We need to get all that out there. And I've identified problem points. And I'm going to go over this. We have a pruning video, I think that's going to come out even tomorrow. A little bit of a premature pruning video. We pruned one tree just to show you guys a demonstration, a quick demonstration of the whole thing. But, you know, this is something that I talk about in that video, is that we really want to have these problem points on our trees identified and cut out, because we always want to be building up and having stronger growth, healthier growth throughout the entire life of our tree. You know, it took me a while really to realize this, and I have points on my trees that are a bit older that really don't look that great, that are a bit damaged, and the cambium in those locations is damaged. And if the cambium is damaged, it inhibits sap flow and nutrient flow, and it just causes a whole bunch of issues, right? So you don't want to be, you know, even having these trees, these areas on your trees at all for your own personal reasons. But certainly when you take these cuttings, you don't want to be giving somebody a cutting that has like an issue like this. I think this is pretty extreme, and I don't think that's really the case of what's happening with a lot of people here. You know, this looks like to me a cutting that's probably been stored for a while, but then again, it is an old cutting, and potentially because it's so old, it's not 1-year-old growth as you see here. It looks even potentially like, you know, 2 or 3-year-old growth, maybe even growth that's been just has a lack of vigor, doesn't have much energy in it, just potentially a mess, this kind of cutting. What you really want, again, is this 1-year-old growth with pretty decent node spacing. You've got yourself fully lignified growth. Doesn't matter if it is or isn't dormant. And the cambium is fully intact, which is right below the bark, right? The bark is brown. Right below that is the living portion of the tree. This has to be alive and green for your cutting to succeed at all. If you don't have green underneath the bark, the cutting will not succeed in that area. And what you should do is cut out all the dead. If there is, by chance, maybe you got a cutting that didn't look so great, or you had a cutting in your storage for about 6 months and it's starting to decay a little bit, cut out the dead, right? Until you get to that green, and then you can then start to root it. You can see right here, this is the green right underneath the bark. So it's really important to keep this into consideration in terms of your cuttings. Um, we already talked about this. This is pretty much, not getting too overzealous with this whole thing. I will tell you that most of the cuttings, and this maybe will be a bit of a contradiction, but most cuttings in the past, when I've received them now that it's October, even in early November or mid-November, if I received them now and I had the intentions of grafting them until the spring and they had to sit in my fridge for 6 months, a lot of them didn't make it. And, well, I wouldn't say a lot of them. I would say about half of them didn't make it. Some of them had portions of the wood that was not salvageable. Some of it was salvageable, and I could graft, let's say, a couple nodes, and I had success. But most of the time, 6 months that goes by, depending on the quality of the cutting, you're going to have a lot of wood that isn't really viable anymore. Even entire cuttings may not be viable. So it's really important that if you're doing this for grafting purposes, you don't want to have this stuff now. And also, you don't want to be grafting now. In fact, this person here is doing grafting now, and this is just not, in my opinion, first off, this person probably doesn't have the right environment. However, you can do this stuff now if it's still warm outside, warm enough to get this graft to take. If the cambiums will get contact, they'll grow together, they'll fuse together with this bud that comes out of the graft. If this doesn't grow, that's what you want. If this starts to put out little meagly, like just weak, thin growth because it's so cold outside, that's not what you want, because you don't want to have to be storing a tree throughout dormancy with weak, straggly growth on it. If anything, what it can happen is that this can take now, and I showed you guys a video, I think this morning, about my Dell's Ermiton fig. And Dell's Ermiton, I had grafted last fall around this time. I think maybe on like the 1st of October about. And I wasn't sure if the graft had taken. And I've done this now for 2 years, by the way. Different trees, different varieties. And it looked like the graft had taken. But I wasn't exactly sure because the graft didn't grow because it's too cold. Exactly what I'm saying here. I overwintered that graft through my storage area, and the next following season the tree woke up really well, because as the trees wake up, all that sap flow comes up from the roots and starts growing out in different directions, pushing growth, pushing energy into different areas of the tree, healthy areas of the tree. And one of them was the graft that I had put on last fall. So you can do this now. It's just not something I recommend. Ooh, excuse me, guys. And it's a bit tricky. However, I would say it's actually a pretty decent time to do some grafting. All right, guys. Let's see. Let's go through some of these questions here that you guys have put in the chat. I want to catch up with you guys. And also, maybe you guys might inspire me to think about some other things that I haven't covered just yet in this episode. All right, so Valerie gives me a heart. What's up, Valerie? TJ, what's going on, TJ? Troy, how's it going, buddy? Christopher, what's going on, buddy? I'm doing well. How about yourself? I've been doing pretty well in the last few days. Been kind of, looking into a little bit of like inflammation in your body and trying to figure out if some of the foods that I'm eating are giving me some inflammation and kind of how to fight all that, and looking into some of the research that's been done. And so right now I've been kind of putting some like time into what I'm eating, because I haven't really been eating too much from the garden, too much from the orchard at this time of the year, especially now everything is cooling down, and almost nothing is ripening now. It's pretty sad. So pretty soon I'm going to start eating some crap and stuff that you have to get at the store, at the grocery store, and even a lot of fruits and vegetables at the store I just refuse to eat, guys. So a lot of things that I eat over the winter is really not that great. I almost starve in the wintertime, guys. I almost starve. So I need to figure out some different things that I can eat in the wintertime and feel healthy and happy. Let's see here. Douglas, what's going on, buddy? Tony DeLeese, what's going on? Let's see. He says, I lost big time from cutting back my trees this year. Yeah, I mean, if you cut your trees too much, it's unfortunate, man. They just they just don't fruit nearly as much. I can see it all across my trees, especially the potted trees. And even in the in-ground trees too, because if you cut them back too much in the in-ground, or if they get killed with a hard frost, you just are set back way big time. So I think hard pruning is really not something we want to do. A light pruning is really the extent of it, just taking off the tip. And we're going to explain all this actually in tomorrow's video, but either taking off the growth tip or taking off as much as no more than 3 to 4 inches of growth. And that's what Pons in his book right here, guys. My buddy Dom still let me have his book. I've been borrowing it for some time. And he mentions in here, and we've talked about this in a prior episode of Fruit Talk, he talks about pruning. And he literally talks about light pruning being defined as taking off no more than 3 to 4 inches of growth. Here, let me look for it. Yeah, so number 1 he defines as, in his book, removing the apical bud, the tip. And then number 2 he defines as light pruning, which is pretty much looks like 2 or 3 nodes and is only about 3 to 4 inches of growth. Whereas 3, which is a medium pruning, looks more like 5 to 6 inches of growth. Then he goes into strong pruning, is number 4, which is like 9 or 10 inches of growth. And then he goes into severe pruning, which looks like 12 to 13 inches of growth. And I'm sure he mentions it somewhere in here, but I'm not going to read through this entire thing unless I can see it very quickly. Yeah, it says here, in the fig trees that produce in August, which are for main crop, which is what almost everybody does, unless you live in England or the Pacific Northwest, pruning must be kept to the minimum possible, virtually reduced to the removal of the apical buds. He doesn't even like people taking off 3 to 4 inches. It says, in young trees, in order to benefit the ramification of fruit-bearing branches, pruning is limited to simply removing the terminal buds. In young trees. In contrast, in older weak trees, these are very old or weak trees, they require a more severe pruning to revitalize the shoots. And that's because young trees are just very vigorous, and they will respond the following year after a hard pruning by putting out too much growth. That's very vigorous, and that growth then of course limits the production. Okay, let's see here. Douglas had a question. When you put your cutting in the moist peat moss, sphagnum peat moss, do you have to maintain that moisture by watering it, or is it left alone? Yeah, it's actually left alone. You water that. Get the sphagnum peat moss if you want to use that. I don't use it, but I guess you could, and it could be worse or it could be better than what I'm doing, depending on how much moisture you put in there. You really want a very minimal amount of moisture in that sphagnum peat moss. You know, like lightly moist is probably the right way of defining that. And then if it's lightly moist and it's in a plastic bag, that moisture will stay in the bag. You won't have to put any more water in there at all. Mad Dog says, Ross, my man, I need your Italian 58 cuttings, pal. Are they on FigVid yet? Not yet. Like I said in the beginning of the video, buddy, I think we're going to take cuttings. Really, realistically, the earliest would be like mid-November. But I may take some varieties. I may take a couple cuts now on certain things that I would rather take now, just to get that out of the way. Personal preference kind of thing. I may do that very soon. I may do that within the next couple of weeks, and I'll have those listed potentially on FigVid. Gigi says, what happens when all the cambium layer here? Can't really see that very well here. What happens when all the cambium layer falls off from the cutting? Rating's still hard, but I noticed the green slimed off. Yeah, well, if the green slimes off, you really got yourself an issue. So unfortunate, but that's the reality, is that if any of this cutting is rotting at the bottom, that's your issue right there. You know, if the cambium layer comes off, the bark comes off, any of it looks like it's slimy in any way, that cutting is mostly dead. Yeah, like Backyard Fig says, kiss that cutting goodbye. Yeah. At that point, the best thing to do is to cut out all that dead growth, right? Cut all that slimy stuff off until you can get to a point that's hard and not slimy and has green cambium. Mad Dog says, I have a tree from the top of the Mount Etna, Sicily, 11,000 feet high. It grows amazing. I'll give you a cutting for free. Okay. Send me a photo, buddy. I want to see. Do you know what the fig looks like? I want to see what the fruit looks like. I'm interested. Yeah, that's awesome of you, buddy. I appreciate the offer. Are you on Facebook, Mad Dog? Contact me somewhere. Email, whatever. Send me a message somewhere. We can talk about it. Troy said, what are the best parafilm / grafting tape? What are the differences and the benefits? I think it's a matter of just preference, personal preference. I don't think there's one that's better than the others. I like to use just standard parafilm. It's just wax. You know, if you go on Amazon as an example, this is not exactly the one that I use, but it's all pretty much the same. I think the difference here in terms of the parafilm, I guess, that I use is that I like the 1/2 inch thickness. Some people like the 1 inch thickness, and depending on the size of the cutting I'm using, the 1/2 inch thickness is better. If it's a larger cutting, the 1 inch diameter, I should say, not thickness, the 1 inch diameter is easier and less difficult on your hands and straining on your hands. And it just makes the wrapping process a lot quicker because it's 1 inch, so you're going around half as often, believe it or not, by having the 1 inch diameter versus the 1/2 inch diameter. And just, you know, I guess you could find a brand that you like, but you know, read the reviews and see what people like. Organic Grow says, hello everyone. What's going on, Organic Grow? They say that my figs are coming in prolifically right now. Looking forward to them ripening. That's awesome. Have you ever noticed, Ross, that figs love to be planted somewhere high and sent their roots down as they choose? They do like to be planted high. I think if they're in higher soil above grade, they have access to more heat and they just perform a lot better. A higher soil temperature in a lot of climates is better. Opposite, though, needs to be true in like desert climates or really warm climates. Simon's here. What's going on, Simon? John says, what would you do with a cutting received now? Well, I try to root it as soon as I could. I'd put it in the fridge and make sure it calloused up well. If the cutting was not lignified well, I would probably root it sooner than later. If the cutting is lignified well, I would just let it hang out in the fridge until I'm ready to root it. I mean, that's pretty much it. Whenever you're ready to root these things, root them as soon as possible. However, I think a better explanation would be, I personally want to start almost all of them at one time. I'd rather do it at once. I'd rather start every single cutting on the same date, so that all the cuttings are at the same stage of life for the most part. You know, there's going to be some stragglers here and there, but for the most part, it's easier to maintain that way, rather than having some cuttings that are really far ahead of the game versus some that are really baby cuttings just put in the soil. It really makes the process, I think, less work, more uniform. So I would rather, if I could, and the quality of the cutting was good, I'd probably wait till like December 1st to start all the rooting. I think December 1st, December 15th, or January 1st, January 15th is probably the best time to start the cuttings. I wouldn't start them indoors. They need a solid 3 months indoors before you can, so if you're doing this, let's say in like March, you're kind of pushing it at this point, because then you only got about 2 months left of the indoor season before you're going to want to bring them outside, and you're not going to want to take care of cuttings inside when it's May, at least in my climate anyway. Brian, what's going on, buddy? He says he likes to rehydrate cuttings if they look dry. That's also a good idea. Sometimes, guys, I noticed this in the pruning video that we did that's going to come out tomorrow, except I didn't mention it in the video, and it's a bit of a shame, but sometimes cuttings, if they're on the tree, they actually look a bit dried up, and then when people receive them, they perceive them to be dry, and it's just, in fact, the way that the cutting looked when it was on the tree. And it just goes to show, you really just never know. I don't know why some of my cuttings look a bit dried, in terms of like, they don't look like they're shriveled up and dead, you know what I mean? But they look like they're, they're not perfect, I guess is a good way of describing it. They don't look, for whatever reason, they don't look like they're perfectly uniform. Some of these have like little ridges in them. And it's a quality cutting, but right then and there, you might get it and say, all right, well, this doesn't look good to me. Yeah, Simon's mentioning fresh fish. That sounds like a great idea in the wintertime. Tony says I need to shape them, hopefully next year more fruit. Yeah, I mean, when you have young trees, you need to get the right form. And then you worry about fruit. Once you got the right form, then you worry about minimal pruning. Tony says, so when I plant my cuttings, I've been giving a fresh cut and scraping a bit of bark and then planting. Yeah, that's good. You can definitely do that, except the part when you scrape it off and then plant it, the only issue there is that that's not calloused. So you're going to have to wait for that to callus for it to put out roots in that location. I'm going to try something a little different this year. We'll see how it works, but that's one way to do it, and that's how I do it personally, Tony. Douglas said, thank you, no problem, buddy. Organic Rose said, as I noticed the difference between planting fig cutting straight in the ground compared to keeping rooted cuttings in a pot on top of soil, the plant sends roots out the pot, and the plant seems more vigorous this way compared to the one right in the ground. Yeah, you're right. It's like a tomato plant or a pepper plant or an eggplant, because they love that warm soil. If you plant them in a raised bed, they do so much better because they just have access to more heat. The soil is a lot warmer. It's X123 says, Ross, what are your thoughts on improved Celeste and Smith for in-ground Zone 7, New York, similar climate to yours? Well, you're going to have to protect them in some way. Otherwise, you're going to get very minimal fruit. because Improved Celeste, unfortunately, is not the hardiest of trees. Neither is Smith. And they both seem to, unfortunately, when you hard prune them, as we mentioned a bit earlier, they in particular, there's some varieties that are affected more than others. But when you hard prune a fig tree, they respond the following year with too vigorous of growth. And the frost and the cold is going to come in zone 7 in New York, and it's going to kill Improved Celeste and Smith all the way to the base, all the way to the ground, and they're going to have to resprout. And those new shoots that resprout from the base are going to grow very vigorously, especially on Smith, especially on Improved Celeste, compared to other varieties. And you're going to have to intervene and change up the hormones in the plant for it to even fruit at all that year. It will, in all honesty, it may just decide to grow and grow and grow all year and not fruit unless you do something about it. So in my personal opinion, it's not a great idea unless you can protect them in some way. I had the bright idea to plant Smith in the ground to see just how hardy it was, just to see. But I really don't have I didn't at the time have high expectations of it really being a great producer. Now that I'm protecting every single in-ground tree that I have, every single in-ground tree this year is going to be chopped down to 6 inches to a foot high. We're going to cut them all back, and it's going to be exactly like a hard pruning, right? Because you're taking out, feet, multiple feet of growth, right? So it's going to be the exact scenario where they're going to respond and grow very vigorously, and I'm going to have to come in and intervene on a large majority of my varieties. I have a technique that we're going to use this year. We talked about it a little bit. It's called girdling, but I'm not exactly going to be girdling them. It's slightly different, and it's hard to explain unless I show it to you. But essentially, I guess you could do it like this. I have my keys here. Let's say that this is the new growth that comes out of the base of the tree, and it's very vigorous, and the hormones are kind of messed up. The balance of hormones is just a mess. What I'm going to do with my knife, let's say that my key here is a knife. I'm going to take my knife down the side just like that, and then I'm going to come around to the other side here, take my knife just like that, and around this side take my knife just like that, and make these really thin incisions in the new growth. This is, by the way, this is green and very bendable, unlignified new growth. This is growth that's like, we're talking maybe, a couple weeks old, like 3 weeks old. And I'm going to take my knife and kind of let the plant bleed a little bit. If I can get it to bleed, I can slow down that vigor. Maybe even it'll change up the hormones inside, and I can get my tree to put out fruit. And that's my goal and my objective this year with a lot of these. And that's why we have them so densely spaced as well, in that I'm able to just throw a tarp over fig trees that are 2 feet apart from each other. I have, in one bed, let's say 50 fig trees, all 2 feet apart from each other. And I'm just going to cover that bed that's, let's say it's 5 foot wide by like 25 feet long. And I can just throw a tarp over that and insulate it a bit, and those will get through the wintertime. But in no way, if I just, had Improved Celeste or Smith out there in the open, would it be a success. You may have to wait, for the soil to really decrease in nutrients and fertility. You probably want a very old tree at that point. So you'd probably have to wait like, 5, 7, maybe even 10 years before you can get something reasonable off of those trees. Let's see here. Gigi said, those small cuttings rooting next to your garage, do they come inside to warmth, or are they okay in the garage for the wintertime? So I think you're talking about the small 1 gallon size trees. Those are going to come in my storage area for the wintertime, but I'm going to let them go dormant. I'm going to let them get hit with a couple frosts before I put them away for the wintertime. And it's just a much better, more natural process when you're young, rooted cuttings. And hopefully they're lignified as well. Hopefully they're lignified. Hopefully you didn't just root them. Hopefully you didn't root them 3 months ago or 2 months ago or 1 month ago. Hopefully these have been rooted for 6, 5, 9 months now. And they're lignified. They're done growing for the wintertime. Let those get hit with the frosts. And then put them away in the storage area for the wintertime. And you're going to have to water those, unfortunately, a bit more than you would your older trees, because the soil in there potentially will dry out a bit quicker, and you don't want that to happen. But you also don't want to overwater them either. They're a bit fragile at that stage, so it's a little tricky. But that's the best way to do it. You don't want to bring them inside. Bringing them inside is just really not beneficial. I'll tell you that right now. Usually it's not that warm. You don't have enough sun. You don't have supplemental lighting, and they almost do nothing inside. And if you let them go dormant, put them outside the following year, and it's a more natural wake-up process, they really go nuts. Your really small cuttings that you rooted are going to turn into huge trees. Technical Man said Can we plant fig trees in sandy soil? We have no frost in our county. Is it better or not? Because we have a zone 11A here. You can plant a fig tree in sandy soil. In zone 11A, are you in a humid climate or a dry climate? I imagine it's probably dry. What you're going to want to do, if you're in a dry 11A climate, you can plant it now, right? Sometime in the fall when the temperatures cool down and it starts to rain a bit more. That's when you want to be planting them, like any fruit tree. And you want to make sure the soil is going to stay wet. So, if it's in sandy soil and it doesn't rain where you live, you're going to have to make sure that you're constantly watering your trees. You know what I mean? Because sandy soil is very well draining, and also it can have a lot of root knot nematodes in it. So you're going to want to most likely add lots of organic material to the soil. Lots of compost, lots of mulch, and water it in well. You're probably going to want to water it for the first few years. It's X says, I do plan to protect the tree for a few years with dry leaves and tarp and then leave them unprotected, but I'm probably better off with different varieties. Yeah, I would say yes. Even if you protect them, what I wouldn't do is protect them the first year. Let the tree die back to the base the first year and let it resprout new shoots from the base. That's a really good process. It's going to put out very vigorous, healthy growth. Protect that growth. Don't protect the growth that just goes in the first year, because it's going to be weaker and it's going to be more difficult to keep that form. Yeah, so let it have like 5 or 6 trunks from the base, and then protect it with leaves and tarps and things like that. But even if you were to protect it and then not protect it after a couple years, it doesn't mean that it's going to do any better. What you really just want is your tree to be in that position for a number of years to adapt itself to this cold that's coming in every year. And it will eventually dig itself in, and it eventually will become better at this crazy weather that we have. Poolman said, if you were just starting out, what would be the first 3 fig varieties would you grow in hindsight? Well, that's a great question, because we kind of get to go back to what we were talking about. That's really what I wanted to finish off this episode here, guys, was that these cuttings that you guys get when you buy them and you trade them they turn into big trees. You know, they start out real small and they may not take up a lot of space, but they turn into big trees. And you don't have to spend a crazy amount of money to get quality fruit either. There is some really high quality varieties that are very commonly found that don't demand a very high price. Things like Violet de Bordeaux, Celeste, Hardy Chicago. Those 3 figs will do well almost everywhere, and they're very affordable. They're so common, and what I would do, I always recommend this. If you want something real cheap, you know what? You want to skip the whole rooting process. You can, because you can probably get really cheap trees from ediblelandscaping.com. And they have some really standard great varieties. They have an improved Celeste, even though this says Celeste. They have Hardy Chicago, LSU Purple, another great variety. Brown Turkey, this is a southern brown turkey. Violet de Bordeaux. Petite Negri here is a Violet de Bordeaux. They even have a green Ischia here. Marseille does well in a lot of climates. LSU O'Rourke does well in a lot of climates. All the figs I just mentioned will do well in almost every climate. And this is just a great nursery to get them from. Like, they're so cheap. You could get, I guess 1 gallons are going to cost you, but a quart pot I think is really affordable. Get like a quart size that's $18. That's pretty cheap. Or you could root them yourselves, and you can get, you know, as an example here, you could get Violet de Bordeaux cuttings for probably for free if you know somebody, if you are nice and you're active on the forum on rfigs.com. There's plenty of people who will give you cuttings. In hindsight, the best variety here probably is Hardy Chicago. That's very commonly found. And I had started out with like 10 different Hardy Chicago types. I got cuttings my first year of like 10 different Hardy Chicago types that went by different names, but they're basically the same fig. There's minor differences. But I would have liked to have had 10 different Hardy Chicago trees. To this day, I think they produce a crap ton of fruit, quality fruit, great flavor. Bella Blue said, "Hi Ross, what's going on, Bella? In the southern hemisphere, we're in mid-spring. Yeah. A few of my fig trees are growing vigorously at the top and the base from under the potting mix. Nothing in the middle. Can I encourage middle growth?" Yeah, you can. You can do some notching. Look up the term notching and you'll see what I mean. And that will get the ideal effect here that you're looking for. Type in like notching branches or something. This is exactly it right here. You make a cut above the bud. This bud isn't suppressed by the apical bud and the auxin, and now this bud now has the freedom to grow. If you're growing them in containers, by the way, I wouldn't worry too much about the middle growth or the growth coming from the base. Really limit the number of trunks coming from the base, whether it's in the ground or in a pot. If you limit the number of trunks from the base, you will eventually have a more productive tree. Technical Man says, "Am my tree having very slow growth? What is making it so vigorous? Well, what do I do to make it more vigorous?" Well, the optimal soil temperature, the optimal soil in terms of the optimal organic material and food in the soil and having the right nutrients in the soil, the right pH of the soil, the right soil moisture, And maybe just a little bit of time. I think that's it. It's really all about the soil there. Kim said, "Hey Ross, aside from figs, any other hobbies that I'm into?" That's a great question. That's a wonderful question. Okay. I got a bunch of hobbies. I love all forms of entertainment. I really like movies and TV shows and music. I just saw, as an example, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. That's a great movie. I also saw Joker. A little too dark for me. Music, I love to sing, and I practice with a buddy of mine. About once a week, we practice some music. He plays guitar and I sing, and then we're hopefully soon or in the near future, we're going to play some live shows. We're going to do a couple live things. Just a couple songs, nothing serious. I like to paint. I do some oil painting. I like to ride my bike. I go cycling quite a bit in the area. In the mornings, I like to go ride my bike around the nearby parks. I played tennis in college, and I still play tennis to this day, like once or twice a week with all my buddies. Yeah, those are some good ones. I like a lot of creative things. A lot of new and interesting things are always great. I love to cook. Anything where I can use my creative mind, I think is beneficial. Sometimes, though, at least with terms of the videos that I do, it's like more of like a chore and a job than something where I can just sit down and be like, all right, well, I'm going to just fully express myself creatively in this. I don't see making videos in the same way, unfortunately, which really kind of sucks, you think about it. I see this whole thing in more of, I guess a job or a chore is not really the greatest way of explaining it, but this is like such a informative educational thing that I like to do, that it's just turned into something like that. And I guess in a teaching position, an educational role as an educator, I don't think it's obviously very difficult to stay creative in that, at least for me, in that way. Yeah, I like great food. That's a great hobby. Food is number one, probably. In terms of making it or preserving it or growing it, trying new food, trying new weird combinations of food, different cultures of food. I think it's a lot of fun. Going to like a nice restaurant in the city. Obviously, I can't cook nearly as well as some really impressive chefs out there, but I can make some pretty good shit. And it's all driven by my desire to eat better tasting food. Yeah, I like to travel too. Oh, and I also like I find joy in investing too. Yeah, I like following the markets and stuff. Whether it's cryptocurrencies or the stock market or gold, the economy, that's what I sort of do for a living in a way. I'm an accountant, so it's good to use the analytical side of my brain as well, not just the creative side. Plus, it's a rush, right? So, Kim, what are you into? Let's see. All right, GG said, do you Black Madeira will ever adapt to Zone 7? Do I think Black Madeira will ever adapt to Zone 7? Whether in ground as it ages. Thanks for all the info. Yeah, they will. All these trees will. It certainly will, for sure. It just may take a while, and you need like 5-10 years minimum for any adaptation really of any sort to really happen, to some, I guess, noticeable degree, let's say. Will I think Black Madeira will ever be like a really good fig in the ground here? Probably not. It's just not rain resistant enough, or split resistant enough, I should say. It's also very late. You need to have the right techniques, man. You got to be a wizard at growing figs. You got to be at a very high level to be able to get Black Madeira to fruit in your climate, in a zone 7 climate, in the ground. If you can do that, you really have attained, you really know what you're doing. Let's just say that. In the Northeast, if you can get Black Madeira to fruit in the ground, you're a pro at that point. You should quit your job and start growing figs professionally. All right, next question. Bella said, easier than I thought. Thanks, you're welcome, Bella. Tony, I know your son plays music. I think you sent me, didn't he make an album or something one time? A couple years ago. Backyard Fig says, yeah, you look like you're getting tired, but how's the Col Noir doing too? Yeah, I do get a little tired in these videos, and especially at night as it is right now, but I think I'm more of an introvert, guys, when it comes to like my energy. And then if I'm sitting here talking to many people, or if I'm at like an event, and like Staten Island as an example, and people are coming up to me and saying hello and asking me stuff, I just get drained of energy pretty quick, because my energy level as an introvert, I think you just need to be alone to regain energy. But yeah, happy to answer the question, buddy. How's Col Noir doing? So Col Noir is doing good. I have 2 trees of it, one in a pot and one in the ground. The one in the ground's growing pretty well. I have enough wood to take a reasonable amount of cuttings from. In the one in the ground. However, I'm like 99.999% sure that it's the exact same thing as a fig that I have called Sucrette, which is, believe it or not, the thumbnail of this video. So yeah, you can look at the figs and how such a high quality that variety is, and how much I really like Sucrette. So Col Noir should be exactly the same. I still have to verify that with Thierry. He said he would look at them again for me, so we'll see. But so far my trees look the same. I haven't gotten fruit off the Col Noir yet, but obviously very high hopes for it, right? I mean, Sucrette is incredible, so if Col Noir is the same thing, it should be equally as incredible. The best case scenario is that they're different, and Col Noir is its own separate variety, and then I have 2 awesome, really awesome varieties that can dry on the tree for me here. I really need to make a post discussion. I want to do a couple things here. I want to talk about, at some point in the future, what varieties really dry well, even in my climate, or I can get them somewhat dried here. What varieties have like the texture of the Col de Dames, or a very thick and dense jammy texture? And then what varieties have like this really elegant berry flavor, sort of like kind of like Black Madeira and Smith. They have this really elegant berry flavor to them. And I want to list those 3 categories out, because those are like my favorite figs to eat. Those are like the best ones. Tony said he had a #1 in the UK. That's awesome. Whoa. Yeah, #1 song in the United Kingdom? That's crazy. What's the song? Kim said food and travel adventures, but currently into a tortoise. Just got 2 babies, so that's keeping me busy and learning more about reptiles. Okay. I don't think I really have the, well, I guess I could keep it inside, but yeah, I would want to have like an area that I could have a tortoise roam around. You guys ever see Jake Mace's videos when he used to live in Phoenix, Arizona, and he used to have the tortoise running around? That was pretty cool. Burmese and Uzbekistan food is pretty great and currently my favorite. Where do you get that stuff? My God. Christopher said, "You're a good man, Ross. Hope to see you soon. Good night, my friend." Good night, Chris. All right, guys. I think I'm going to call it. I don't really know exactly. There was probably more that I wanted to touch on in this episode of Fruit Talk. There's definitely some things that I said, you know what? Maybe I should write these down as I go, because there's a lot of people who have been pretty confused on the whole thing. There's a lot of new people on our figs, and a lot of people who have been kind of really, just been asking a lot of questions on our figs about cutting season and what to expect and what to make of this whole thing. I think I cleared up a lot of points, and maybe I made it so simple that maybe a lot of questions or a lot of points have already been made, I guess. I don't know. But anyway, guys, again, hopefully this episode here paid for itself. If you're interested, it'd be greatly appreciated if you guys would support what I'm doing here on Patreon, even as little as $1. It'd be great. Also, check out the blog, guys. FigBoss.com. I'm now Ross the Fig Boss. We're gonna make some changes pretty soon to this. I keep saying that, but I actually have the artists doing their thing now, and we should have a couple changes to the blog. We still have to get this blog. This is on the list here of things to do in the very near future, is get all this, believe it or not, on Google. It's not even on Google yet. If you were to try to add any there's no SEO actually on the website at all right now. So we'll get that whole thing straightened out. Maybe we can make the blog something somewhat popular for people who are interested in growing figs. They can kind of come here, and that's the goal, is to put enough content on the blog so that the blog can get really popular, which can then direct traffic maybe to the website or to the YouTube channel, and also to the consulting page. And it just seems to make a whole lot more sense to do it this way, as my buddy John explained to me. All right, guys, we'll see y'all soon. All right, and if you want to know when I'm going to start selling cuttings again, sign up on the blog, and also check us out on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter, and we'll see you guys soon. All right, take care. I hope everyone had a really nice night. Yeah, good night, everyone.